Hello and welcome to the PLSA Academy's webinar on fiduciary management. My name is John MacDonald. I'm an Institutional Relations Director at Kempen Capital Management, and I'm joined here today by my colleague Jeff Neate, who's the Head of Client Portfolio Management at Kempen, and by Rikhav Shah, who's a Director at EY and heads up their Fiduciary Manager Selection and Monitoring team. This is our second webinar this year with the PLSA on the topic of fiduciary management. And this time we look at fiduciary manager selection, we look at the transition to fiduciary management, and we look at the ongoing oversight of your fiduciary manager once in place. In the previous webinar, which is still available on the PLSA's website, we looked at the origins of fiduciary management in the Netherlands and how it is evolving in the UK. And why we looked at why now more than 1 in 8 schemes in the UK actually use fiduciary management in some form, and that the market continues to grow at something like 20 to 30% per annum and shows no sign of slowing down. We also looked at cost transparency, which is critical in fiduciary management, and it's an area that's coming under increasing scrutiny from the FCA and the CMA, and we'll cover that in some more detail later. We looked at the different approaches to fiduciary management and how the different models work. And we also touched on how to monitor your fiduciary manager using independent oversight, and that's something that we'll expand on today. So first of all, a brief word on Kempen and who we are. Kempen is a merchant bank, long-established merchant bank. We have a large business in asset management, and we've been doing fiduciary management for pension funds and other institutional investors since 2004. We now have something like £50 billion in assets under management in FM, and that accounts for about 3/4 of total assets under management. And we have around 40 full fiduciary management clients, ranging in size from £50 million up to £8 billion. So today we plan to cover off 3 areas that follow on from our previous session. First of all, the fiduciary manager selection process and what best practice looks like. Secondly, considerations once you've made your decision on your fiduciary manager and are transitioning to the new arrangements. And thirdly, ongoing oversight and monitoring of your fiduciary manager. And can I just say to everyone, please don't hesitate to ask questions on your screen. There's a field there on your screen, and just ask questions and we'll try and answer them as we go along. So let's get started with the selection process. Jeff, over to you. Why don't you kick off with your views on fiduciary manager selection?
Sure. So we're here today to talk about selecting a fiduciary manager. So we're going in with the assumption that you as a trustee board have already decided that fiduciary management is the way forward, or at least is something very interesting and worth investigating. And in the course of doing that, you may have actually met 1 or 2 fiduciary managers, dipped some toes in the water, especially if your existing investment advisor actually offers fiduciary management services themselves.
But importantly, I think you have to recognize that before getting to that decision around going down that fiduciary management route, what is the governance and what are the challenges with the existing governance model? The reason why that's important is to then think about what does that mean for your fiduciary management mandate. It's easy to think about fiduciary management as being encompassing the total assets of the scheme. And whilst that is true for a lot of schemes, that varies in terms of exactly what is delegated. Some schemes might be comfortable with the hedging part and are looking to delegate something else, or it might just be a part of the sleeve. And it's really important just to be very clear about exactly what it is that you're delegating.
No, absolutely, Rikhav. So one way or another, we've got to a point where we're interested in selecting and potentially appointing a fiduciary manager. So what does best practice look like? Well, we're going to talk about that for the next hour or so. But in a nutshell, what we're talking is independent help, independent advice to select and to appoint that manager. And then on an ongoing basis, independent help with the oversight of that fiduciary manager and the way the relationship's going, the way that the things are going with the portfolio. And I think it's worth saying at the start here that whilst everyone kind of agrees there's a consensus around that best practice, it doesn't consistently happen. And that's a point that the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, has been raising over recent years. They've referred it to the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, who are in the middle of their review at the moment. And in the press noise that's been going on around that, there have been people, commentators, accusing some of the players in the market of flipping, of transitioning clients from an investment advisory model to a fiduciary management model without really going through a genuinely competitive process to decide whether that party is the right party to deliver the new service.
And that's something the CMA has been particularly focused on, isn't it, Jeff? So I think before moving on, we're just going to hear from our Head of Investment Strategy at Kempen, Nikesh Patel, on his views on the CMA review.
The Competition and Markets Authority, or CMA, has provisionally found that there is an adverse competition impact in the fiduciary management and investment consulting industry. They proposed a series of remedies aimed to address their concerns. These remedies aim to reduce investment consultants' influence in selecting fiduciary managers, in improving competition within the fiduciary management sector, improving trustee engagement, which can only be a good thing, and finally improving the cost transparency and comparability of fees between investment consulting models and fiduciary models. The CMA's remedies will help to address these concerns. Particularly helpful are the issues of cost transparency and comparability. But having said that, this will be particularly difficult for those models which are reliant on fund of funds, on tied investment consulting products, or those which are using internally managed asset management products. On the structure and governance of UK pensions, the CMA is right to highlight that the primary issue is the low level of trustee engagement. Unfortunately, the remedies do not go particularly far in addressing low levels of engagement. What they lack is any real push to improve the skills and experience of a trustee board, and in particular the amount of expertise that they can draw upon. I'm in favour of a push towards consolidation, master trusts and fiduciary management, as these can improve trustee engagement and allow them to focus on what matters. However, there must be a level playing field between different fiduciary managers, even once low levels of trustee engagement are addressed. In particular, we must focus on a level playing field for fiduciary managers to deliver the right outcomes for members of pension schemes. Despite the investigation and despite the remedies proposed, I think we have to look beyond the CMA remedies to address the concerns in the industry and to ensure that members really are receiving the right solution for them.
So Nikesh clearly has some strong views there on the CMA review and on fiduciary manager selection and monitoring generally. Rikhav, would you like to give us your thoughts?
Sure. So if we just take a step back even from the CMA, we're now in a world where there are a lot of fiduciary management providers and solutions out there. So there is actually that ability, the trustees have that ability to actually look at what's out there. There is a lot of choice out there. So it's almost, why wouldn't you do that, regardless of where the CMA lands? Fiduciary management is not a product, it's not homogeneous. The way Kempen run their fiduciary management solution is very different to how others will do that. So what you get through by actually going through a process, there's a big part of education, so learning about actually what do different providers do, how do they add value from a different perspective. But it also just allows you to evolve as your own requirements are moving along and actually find the perfect fit for your own scheme. So, regardless of where the CMA comes out, given we have that opportunity, it's almost like, why wouldn't we take advantage of that?
I mean, you're absolutely right to point out there are different styles of fiduciary manager and different approaches. Equally, I'd turn that round on you and say, well, there are different types of selection consultants with different focus on different area, different expertise, different approaches.
I'd agree with that, Jeff. I mean, I used to be one myself, in fact, in a previous role. And I think you need to be very cognizant of the fact that different firms have their different ways of going about the selection process, their own views, and perhaps sometimes other businesses that are in conflict with the selection business. So you kind of need to be aware of the different approaches that different selection consultants take. And we actually have another clip here from my colleague Christy, who heads up our UK consultant relations business, and he has some perspectives on the selection consultant market.
Independent advisors are playing an increasingly important role within the fiduciary management setup, both in terms of function and their benefit to clients and fiduciary managers. Choosing a fiduciary manager is a bit like choosing a builder to help you improve your house. Unless you're an expert, you can feel a little lost. You're relying on finding the right company that you like, ensuring that the price is acceptable, and you might even take some references. But then you're really crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. you can't really do that. You're guardians of your assets. You have to ensure that you are thinking about the right things. A fiduciary advisor could help you in terms of helping you navigate the various flavors of fiduciary management and to find the right party and the right partner for you. In fact, we believe that one of the biggest risks out there is that when you're selecting a fiduciary manager, both the client and the fiduciary manager can sometimes think and assume that the other party knows or understands certain things. In fact, that's not always the case. Being conscious of that risk, we can clearly minimize that, but having a selection advisor can help further minimize it as well. In terms of resourcing the trustees and giving them expertise to ask the right questions at the right time to monitor us, to challenge us, and to manage us. We have found that an independent advisor is invaluable to both our clients and to us. There are a number of fiduciary independent advisors out there now, and a number of them have really looked under the bonnet, and they can really set out the pros and cons of each manager. And finally, from a governance perspective, we think it's important to be able to demonstrate that you as a trustee can monitor the fiduciary manager. So overall, I think it makes a lot of sense from a governance perspective too.
So thanks to Christy for those perspectives. And can I just remind everyone that you can ask questions as we're going along. There's a field on your screen. Just fill out the question, and we will try and answer those questions to the best of our ability. So Christy's made the point there, and I think we'd all agree that having independent advice when going through the selection process for a fiduciary manager makes sense. It's good practice. But it sounds like there's a price tag involved. There's bound to be a price tag involved. Rikhav, as one of those selection consultants, could you maybe take that question?
Yeah, sure. So wouldn't it be nice if we could get all of this without having to pay for anything? I think we need to think about cost in the materiality of overall cost of fiduciary management. And our view certainly would be that there is that cost. It's a one-off cost, but it's certainly much smaller in the grand scheme of overall fiduciary management costs. Now, you might think, of course, I would say that. But let's think about what are we getting on the other side out of it? It's not, I mean, what we found is that you can get a lot better costs from going through the tender. And even if we just look at it across, over time, how fiduciary management costs have gone. And here we're talking not just about the fiduciary manager's fees, we're talking about the selection advisor's fees, the asset management fees. What we found over several years of running various surveys that the total cost has actually come down. There are now numerous examples of schemes who have moved from an advisory arrangement into a fiduciary arrangement for reasons to manage risk better, but in the process have also managed to reduce their total costs. And it's important to think about it in the context of total costs, so that you can then question, actually, if we're paying this much, what are we getting out of it? And then that total cost piece is actually really important for you to get a proper apples for apples comparison. So, very good perspectives there, Rikhav. Could you maybe just expand a little bit on what a best practice evaluation of a fiduciary manager looks like? Sure. Right. So I think the starting point has got to be about being very, very clear and precise about what the requirements are, both from a trustee perspective and from a sponsor perspective. And this isn't just about return targets and journey plans, but what is the underlying investment philosophy and beliefs that are really, really important to you. This then moves on into having a process to being able to find a short list of managers who are quite likely to meet that, and then sharing that with those fiduciary managers. What are your views? What is it that you really want out of them, so that your fiduciary managers can propose solutions that actually meet those requirements. A key part of what we do is involved in that earlier stage in just terms of really identifying to the detail exactly what trustee requirements are, because it is important that these selection processes are bespoke to every scheme. right? Your circumstances are different, so your selection process needs to be. There's then a big piece about actually spending enough time in evaluating the fiduciary managers. Fiduciary managers offer a very wide range of services. They have different investment philosophies and processes, the operational models, the fees and costs. And so it's important to actually have an objective means of going through each one of those, assessing them properly, spending enough time on it. So it sounds like, it is quite a big exercise, but you are spending quite a lot of time. And obviously what we're doing is helping to provide all of the research knowledge of fiduciary managers to try and match it with, trustee requirements. In total, we've found that takes a process of, the shortest ones can be, as short as 6 weeks, but, 3 months being kind of quite typical of getting the full process done.
And so once you've made the big decision and you've decided which manager to appoint, you've been through the process with Rikhav, how about the transition? Jeff, maybe you could take that one. What does the transition to fiduciary structure look like?
Well, you may be tempted to think that after all that hard work over 3 months, you've got the bulk of it done, and now it's just a question of signing a few bits of paper. Well, fiduciary management is not a product, it's a solution. And actually, you're only halfway there at the point that you've selected the manager. And it's really important as a trustee board that you invest the time, that you invest the resources in the appointment phase so that you get it right first time, you get that relationship working how you want to. So the three main components of appointment are firstly what we call onboarding, so establishing the legal and an operational relationship between the pension plan and the fiduciary manager. Secondly, the review of investment strategy that you'll likely want to do. And thirdly, the physical transition of the assets from the control of your existing investment advisor or existing fiduciary manager to the new party. And the trick here, if you want to get this done swiftly, is not to do those three things sequentially in the order I've described, but rather to try and run them in parallel as much as possible.
So it's interesting that you say there that you mentioned the transition not just from a traditional advisory arrangement, but actually there are transitions from a fiduciary arrangement. So that's starting to happen now. You're seeing people transitioning from their first fiduciary manager onto another one.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We are starting to see that. A number of schemes have had a fiduciary manager for 3, 5, 8 years now, and they might have had a good experience out of it. Actually, a lot of them have. But what's changed and what's making them actually think about changing a fiduciary manager? First is pretty much just a change in their own circumstances in terms of funding position, maturity. There's also been a change in terms of how they're thinking about the real end game, whether it's buy-in and buyout or how they're defining that. And again, that market's changed quite a lot. But the biggest driver we find is that there's a lot more choice available in the market now. So particularly for schemes that actually didn't go through a competitive piece, just the fact that there is that much choice and we can actually look at something which is perhaps better now, a better fit for our objectives, is encouraging trustees to at least think about looking at others. So we are seeing some of that. That's not saying that the fiduciary managers have been there in the past have done a bad job. It's just a function of the changing nature of the market.
So shall I talk a bit about the first component, the onboarding? The key item here is the legal agreement that you're going to establish between the plan and the fiduciary manager. And it might seem like a boring legal document, but it really, really isn't. And as a trustee, there are particular areas of that you really do need to get into and understand. You're going to understand the liability. You're going to look at the clauses around the investment guidelines, which are often being an annex to that agreement. You're going to want to look at the service levels around the investment advisory and execution, reporting, monitoring services that you're receiving. And one area which I think hasn't received the focus it deserves is the exit clauses. What happens should we decide to move on elsewhere? To what extent are we locked in? And that is one thing that I don't think people realise varies massively between different fiduciary managers. So as you go through this process, you've probably already in the process of selecting a manager whittled down the big ticket items, the outline, the sketch, if you like, of how the relationship's going to work, what services you need and want. But now's the opportunity to get the detail right. And I'd really encourage you to try and get that detail right first time. Make sure that the relationship you're building really meets the needs of the scheme and is going to give you the best chance of meeting your objectives, getting to full funding, paying those pensions as they fall due. And this is an area where I'd strongly recommend any client to involve a third party, even if you're not going to involve them in the selection, definitely involve them in this stage, because there's so many nuances and so many details, and it just really is better to get that right first time.
Thanks, Jeff. Some interesting points there. So before we move on, let's just hear from one of Kempen's clients, Mira Mohideen of the MenCap pension plan, on her experience of the transition to fiduciary management.
The service that we were going to receive was very key to the trustees. So right throughout the selection process, we focused on this. Once Kempen was appointed, we had a series of meetings with them to hone it down, because we wanted everything to be set out clearly and the fees to be transparent, and we were able to influence the final document and the schedules. In terms of the transition, I was involved initially to make sure all the parties were informed of the appointment, as well as getting all the documentation signed. Once that was done, Kempen did all of the work in relation to the transition. I got involved just in providing background information and other documents that they needed on an ad hoc basis. It took us some time to set up the custodian agreement and also to cross the T's and dot the I's in the investment management agreement. And so it's important to note that this takes time. We also had weekly meetings to keep abreast of progress.
So some interesting views there from from the coalface from Mira. Jeff, do you want to just expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, let me talk a little bit about how we can get some more things running in parallel here to make this transition happen. So take a step back. How does fiduciary management work? There are two main models. What you're essentially trying to do is to delegate certain decisions, delegate control to the fiduciary manager. And you can do that by a power of attorney, literally, legally giving the fiduciary manager the right to take actions, to make decisions on your behalf. Or you can do it by a fund of funds model, which some of our competitors use. And in that case, it's the fact that the assets go into the fiduciary manager's fund of funds that thereby gives them, as manager of that fund of funds, control over the decisions. But under either model, it's only once you finish the onboarding process that the fiduciary manager gets any control over the assets. You've got to have, for the power of attorney model, you've got to have the legal agreement in place, you've got to have the investment guidelines agreed, and then the power of attorney goes live. And for the fund of funds model, of course, until the money is actually in the fund of funds, the fiduciary manager has no control over it. But that doesn't mean that you can't run things in parallel. And the way that we would do this under our model is with what we call a temporary power of attorney. And what that enables us to do is to get working on the transition in parallel with the legal agreements being sorted out. So what sort of things would we do with our temporary power of attorney? Well, the most important and obvious thing is start liaising with the existing asset managers, understand from them what the portfolios look like, plan the transition. And that certainly takes time, especially if you want to manage the transition efficiently and minimize unnecessary costs. What we might also do if there's illiquid assets, there can often be long notice periods, a month, 2 months, even 3 months on some of the assets. So if we can give notice on the trustee's behalf, that can speed up the transition. And then there might be some big ticket items. So for example, if we've already established that the main impediment to getting where we want to go in a least risk way is the fact that we're not hedging the liability risks, well, even with a temporary power of attorney, we can instruct an existing manager to increase hedge ratios, potentially.
Thanks, Jeff. So you mentioned investment strategy earlier. Now, why should appointing a fiduciary manager mean that I need to review my investment strategy? Rikhav, maybe you could take that one.
It doesn't. But before we go there, let's just be very clear about exactly what we mean by investment strategy and what are the execution functions, right? So if we're thinking about, if you've done a big journey plan review and you're thinking about what's the expected return that you need to get there because you've had a different schedule of contributions, you've had a covenant review, etc. That's fine. Your journey plan doesn't have to change. But the way in which you actually then execute it might need to change. So you might need to think still about it. Your fiduciary manager might have a very different philosophy in terms of how they're going to execute them. And so at least you want to just make sure that all of that execution function ties back to the investment strategy that you have arranged. So it doesn't actually have to involve a full-scale investment strategy review. You might just need to make some finessing around it.
Yeah, I'd agree, I think, with the first point, that it doesn't have to imply an investment strategy review, but I would nuance that it depends on the model. Yeah. So if you're in the power of attorney model, then absolutely 100% agree. We can take on an existing strategy, we can take on an existing manager roster, onboard that into the platform, you get the governance benefits, the risk reporting, the monitoring. But nothing need change immediately in the assets, if that's what you want. On the fund of funds model, not so much. I think that's harder to do for managers that operate on that basis, but you can still run an approximation to an existing investment strategy. But I guess the point is, would you want to do that? And I think it's probably not a question of whether you review the investment strategy, it's more a question of when. So if you're happy with your existing strategy, where you are in the valuation cycle means it's not the right time to do it, then yeah, absolutely. Let's get the onboarding, get the transition of the assets done, and then we can look at strategy afterwards. If one of your main reasons for appointing a fiduciary manager actually is that you're not happy with the investment strategy, then you might want to bring that much more up front. Run the investment strategy review in parallel with the selection. You might even part of your selection criteria might be that you actually ask those fiduciary managers to do an outline investment strategy review, and depending on what they propose, whether you think that works with the advice of your independent consultant, that might influence who you select. So I think it really is horses for courses, and it will depend on the approach that the trustees take to the whole concept of delegation. If they're very comfortable with it, you can change investment strategy up front. If trustees are saying, well, we are a bit concerned about losing control, we want to delegate step by step, then you're more likely to leave the investment strategy review a bit later in the process. It perhaps phase it in so the fiduciary manager does give you a wider toolbox. There'll be new asset classes you can use, but you may be a trustee board who find it important to understand what you're investing in. You want to take time to have the trustee education and understanding so that you're really happy with every piece as it comes into the portfolio. And we can support both models, of course.
Thank you, Jeff. And before moving on, can I just remind you that you are able to ask questions via the orange Ask a Question box. And in fact, it looks like a couple of you have worked that out already, which is great. So let's just stop and have a couple of questions. First of all, the first one up here is, what is the typical timescale from appointment to completed transition and everything working smoothly? Who'd like to take that, Jeff?
Yeah, happy to take that. No, so our sort of template runbook for this works on a timescale of 3 months. If it's a very simple, straightforward transition, we can potentially compress that a bit. But we do work on a basis of 3 months. That can extend on factors like I was talking about if the trustees want to go a little bit more step by step. And it does really depend not just on the effort that we put in, but it also depends on the willingness of the trustees to really put some focused time and effort around the things like the legal documents and the investment strategy.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. And just stepping back from the transition back to the first topic on fiduciary manager selection, we have another question here. I think it's probably a good one for Rikhav. So selection consultants have conflicts of interest in that they can either provide investment consultancy services or they can provide fiduciary oversight. How do they help clients understand and manage those conflicts, Rikhav?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the point around conflicts has been, it's been discussed right through from, investment consultants who offer fiduciary management services, investment consultants who provide fiduciary management oversight. And I think across this, it's really important to understand, all the areas in which every organization is playing. There will be conflicts, and then it's really then important to understand actually what's the implication of those conflicts on the trustees. Now we don't, we've actively taken a decision to only offer, investment governance or fiduciary management selection services. The question around, if there is that conflict, we've had situations where fiduciary managers are competing with investment consultants where trustees have not exactly decided on their governance model. Now, that kind of an organization, an investment consultant who is, really playing on both sides, it can become quite tricky when they go and try and research fiduciary managers, or, how do you make sure you're getting all of that information? How does all of that information then come back to the trustees? So it is important when trustees are looking for a selection consultant to just be aware of exactly, not just the piece that the provider is doing on the selection, but right across the business, what are the different areas in which they play, and then make a decision based around that.
Great, thanks, Rikhav. So, as I say, more questions very welcome. Please use that orange box to ask a question. So we'll move on from the transition to the last topic on the agenda, which is the monitoring and oversight of the fiduciary manager. So, excuse me. So once the transition's complete and the immediate changes to investment strategy have been put in place, all of the parties can get on with business as usual. So how does that look? Let's maybe, Rikhav, if you could take the kind of how does that look in theory, and Jeff, you could maybe address the how does it look in practice as down in the weeds as a fiduciary manager. So first of all, with you, Rikhav.
Yeah. So as you're going through the selection process, you want to have reporting at the back of your mind. You want to know once you have a fiduciary manager in place, what reporting are you going to get back? So you look at that, and if you need anything, specific, either from the trustees or company's perspective, you get all of that, agreed upfront. You then, once all of that's done, you're using your regular meetings to then understand where performance is coming from. This may not be the detail of exact, 1% of every manager, but it's actually at the higher level. What are the asset classes that are contributing? What's not kind of doing that well? And also using that whole reporting process as an education process, because these portfolios do evolve over time, and it's a means of you to keeping up with that with your fiduciary management structure. The whole idea behind this, and we provide independent oversight, and the whole idea behind kind of keeping this ongoing is to make sure that you can evolve your fiduciary mandate. If there's a change in circumstances, there needs to be a change in benchmark, return target, whatever criteria. You're just kind of the aim of this monitoring is to make sure that this keeps up and the mandate remains fit for purpose.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I mean, we work with a number of different monitoring oversight consultants. Each have got their own approach. Some of it's light touch, some of it's much more involved. And there are clients for whom an annual review, a little health check, is all they feel they need. I have to say, from our perspective, where you do get that ongoing involvement, the ongoing challenge and discussion, even situations where the independent is sitting in every investment committee meeting or every trustee meeting and providing a second opinion on the advice, providing a second opinion on the performance. Actually, we value that. You might think that as a fiduciary manager, we'd prefer not to have someone breathing down our neck, but that's not the case. We don't have anything to hide. Investment is a complex matter, and having another professional at the table who's able to give the trustees confidence that, yes, this is a big decision to hedge your liability risks, and yes, we're using some scary things called derivatives, but this really is the best thing, and you have to do this because otherwise, in the event of such and such a scenario, you're going to blow the funding ratio out of the water. Having someone else at the table saying the same thing, that's really valuable, and it's been very effective as a means of getting clients to where they need to be to protect the position of their pensioners much more quickly.
So thanks for that, Jeff. So a question that I hear frequently, and I'm sure you do too, Rikhav, is so how does it feel? How's it going? What does it look like with a fiduciary manager in place? How does it feel? And usually I think within that question, there's a kind of underlying question about control. How much control am I giving up? How much control am I going to retain? Can you maybe address that point about control?
What do you need control about is the real question, right? Let me just take a step away from fiduciary management for a moment. When I'm driving, I want to have control over the steering wheel, the brakes, the accelerator, possibly the sat nav, but I don't need control over everything that's going on. And I certainly don't have control over exactly what's happening in the engine. Now, let's bring that back into fiduciary management. When you've got a journey plan, that's in the trustee's control. That's the biggest strategic decision. Any methodology that you have around reducing risk over time, again, that's all in your control. Fiduciary management agreements, they've got an investment schedule where you can put a number of restrictions, whether it's around asset classes, liquidity, hedging levels. There is kind of quite a lot of room to bespoke that. Granted, that's more so for larger schemes than smaller schemes, but there is still a lot of ability to put all of these restrictions. So you're actually putting in quite a lot of that control in right up front by the design of the mandate. What you don't have control over is manager selection and portfolio construction. But that is precisely why you're hiring a fiduciary manager. You're hiring a partner, and that's really important. You're hiring a partner who can execute that portfolio construction and manager selection piece to fit in with the pieces that you have control over. So you still have got control over all the big ticket items, and you've got a partner who's controlling all of those underlying pieces the way you have agreed to do them. So in aggregate, overall control, whether it's from the decisions that you take or the decisions that your fiduciary manager is taking and reporting back to you, is actually higher under a fiduciary mandate.
Couldn't agree more. But then I mean, taking the perspective of our clients, and if we go, especially back in the early days, back in the noughties, yes, there was a concern before they were working with us. The fiduciary management was a new thing back then. They were concerned, does this mean we're losing control? Are we fulfilling our duty to our members? And we worked through that, and we talked through it and made some of the points that Rikhav's made. But if I talk to those same clients now, they haven't got that concern. They feel very much in control. They've got a strong governance model. They understand the big picture, and they know that if there is a detail they want to drill down, or their consultant wants to drill down, we will get all the numbers out of the box. This isn't like, I mean, you might be already investing in a DGF, a diversified growth fund, and that's another form, even if you didn't realise it, that's a form of delegation. You're delegating actually investment strategy, asset allocation, all sorts of things. But the difference with fiduciary management is it's not a black box like that. This is something where even if you start with a dashboard, you will get the drill down, you will get the answers. And ultimately, you do have the influence, perhaps a bit harder with a fund of funds model, but certainly with a power of attorney model. You have influence over every aspect if you choose to. And choose is really the right word. I mean, another way of phrasing what you said is don't have a dog and bark yourself.
So I think what you're saying, Jet, I think sometimes people maybe assume that they're going to spend less time on investments once they've appointed a fiduciary manager. But I don't think you're saying that. I think that you're saying they'll spend just as much time, but perhaps more focused on big picture items.
Yeah, that certainly early on, that was one of the big myths around fiduciary management, that this is a wonderful magic bullet that will suddenly mean that all you need to do on investment is spend 15 minutes a quarter reading a report and ticking a box. And really that was unhelpful, I think. Yes, there are situations where we've seen trustee boards spend less time on investment and be able to balance out their agendas. But in the majority of situations, what we've seen is trustees spend the same amount of time, but on very different topics. So instead of focusing on the operational details, focusing on legal agreements with every single manager selection, they're actually standing back. They're looking at the big picture. What are the risks we're hedging? What are we exposed to? Let's think about the long term. How does our investment strategy fit in with our funding plan? How will we de-risk over time? What's our end game? How does that actually integrate with the covenant short term and long term? And then you're talking integrated risk management, integrating the funding piece, the investment piece, and the covenant piece. And that's so much better use of time than grilling managers every quarter.
So the trustee gets to focus on the big picture. Now, what does that kind of mean practically? What can you do to help the trustee focus on the big picture?
I think an important part of it is how you approach the quarterly reporting, quarterly, monthly reporting, whatever the client prefers. I think in the old world, people would sort of have a big pack of reports from different asset managers, and they go through them one by one, and you drill down into why this manager was overweight that sector and where this performance came from, and you very quickly not seeing the wood for the trees. Our approach is to start at the top level, saying, look, we've got this journey plan, we're trying to get from A to B on the funding position so that we can pay pensions. How have we done this quarter? Has the funding ratio gone up as we expected it to? If not, why not? What drove that change? Was it the strategic asset allocation? Was it the fact that the actuarial assumptions maybe were reviewed, people are living longer? Is it the fact that one of the risks that we didn't completely hedge has bitten us? And so by starting from the top down, you make sure that you're spending your time on the important elements of the attribution, not necessarily the first thing that's in the pack.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So we've got, the questions are coming in thick and fast. There are a couple here that I think are basically asking the same question, and I think they're for you, Rikhav. And that's essentially stepping back again to thinking about, actually thinking probably even before the selection exercise. How can I better decide what role I want my provider to play? And so how can we decide the level of delegation and the flavour of fiduciary management that would work best for us? So that's a question almost before the selection process.
Excellent. And you're not alone in asking that question. A number of trustees have asked this question, and essentially what we've done is saying, right, let's start from what you have at the moment, and let's just look at how you're running every part of the investment process. So what are you doing around investment strategy? What are you doing around portfolio construction, any kind of dynamic asset allocation, managed selection, et cetera, et cetera. And what we're trying to do there is not to pick on all the decisions that you made, but actually what is your process? So remember, fiduciary management is a means of improving governance. It's a governance solution, not just a pure investment solution. We've then kind of taken that, and what we've found that you have a lot of schemes who have done pretty good, in some areas, but then not all. And so by going through the investment cycle bit by bit, you've actually kind of figured out exactly where is it that you need help. Sometimes it's also worth kind of doing the same thing across different asset classes. And for that, we've seen, so for example, particularly with hedge funds and private markets, which are just that much more difficult to get your heads around, a number of trustees will say, actually, with the rest of the portfolio, we're comfortable, but here we need a much higher level of delegation, right? So doing that governance review, just kind of, it does need a bit of, looking back and just introspecting about how things have been done over the last 3 to 5 years. It then allows you to create a governance model that is very targeted for your own needs, and then you'd start driving your fiduciary mandate from that point onwards.
Great. Thanks, Rikhav. And so another question on I guess, the level of delegation and the model that you decide to adopt. And I think this is one for you, Jeff. So you have spoken about delegation. Can the strategic benchmark and/or investment objective be changed at any time?
Short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is every time you make a significant change in the assets, you're going to incur costs. And those costs will depend on the type of assets we're talking about. From one end of the scale, it might be a few basis points on US equities. And then you go through the scale. European equities, we've got some transaction taxes involved. You go through credit, where the markets are less liquid, you can pay 50 basis points up to 100 basis points, depending on the type of credit we're talking about. Through to illiquid assets, where you might have huge penalties if you redeem early, or you may actually not be able to. There may be lock-ins. And so, yes, you can keep chopping and changing, but the whole idea of a pension plan is that we've got 50, 60, 70 years to pay these liabilities, and we really should be coming up with a long-term plan and sticking to it,
And sticking
because
to
we'll
it.
incur an awful lot of costs otherwise.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. If I can just add to that, I mean, we talked about control earlier, and so you've got control about the strategy. And if you're saying that you need to change your return target from plus 2.8 to plus 2.5, of course you can do that. It's kind of when you start getting into the finer details there. I'll probably pick Jeff's line again. You don't want to have a dog and bark yourself. So it's kind of having that right balance.
Yeah. So, great. Another question. And can I just remind everyone, we do have time for more, so please use that orange field. Let's take this one. To what extent, this is for both of you perhaps, maybe you could both have some views on this. To what extent do you believe the terms of reference of committees will change under a fiduciary management structure? Rikhav.
Yeah, so let me talk through this by giving some examples of what has happened. So there's quite a few different ways. So for some, actually, it's not changed investment committee terms very much. Jeff talked earlier about the focus around those meetings becomes more around strategic, integrated risk management. And so the time amount is the same, but then they're thinking a lot more about strategic pieces. And so there is a bit of a change in terms of, they're still responsible for that, but then they're spending more time. There have been others where their investment committees used to spend a lot of time talking about individual managers. That's kind of gone, and for some of those schemes, therefore, they have just done away with their investment committees and just go. Everything just happens under the trustee board meeting. And then there's a few others who have had integrated risk management committees, so very much a strategic committee, and then a separate committee which was responsible for the investment implementation. Now, once that delegated piece is gone, that implementation piece goes away. But they've also started thinking about, all right, we've done this for our DB assets. What about DC? And so instead of it's a new committee essentially that's come on to think about, right, how do we create a best-in-class governance solution in the DC space? So there's quite a range. It is very much bespoke to every trustee client, and perhaps you have other examples. And
Yeah, no, a lot of that rings true with our experience. I guess just quote one example, which is quite interesting because of the way it evolved over time. So we had a client a few years ago where it was one of these ones that, they were a little bit nervous about losing control. They wanted to delegate piece by piece. And they were coming into it actually with a very traditional, kind of plain vanilla, simplistic portfolio. And they'd never had an investment committee before. But they realised once they started working with us, we were moving to a much more sophisticated, much more effective investment strategy. But it did require more time. It did require more focus. They needed to spend time being educated. They wanted to take those decisions step by step about delegating different pieces of the service to us. So we advised them to set up an investment committee. That ran for a few years. And we got to a point last year where they got very comfortable with the new model. They'd delegated an awful lot of staff. And actually, the investment committee had run its course. That was no longer necessary. It came back and became an agenda item on the main trustee board again.
Good. Thanks, Jeff. Some good practical insights there into life with a fiduciary manager. I have another question here, which is along the similar lines. How does it feel having a fiduciary manager in place? And the question is, and maybe for you, Rikhav, with your wider view, perhaps of the market, what is the regular performance monitoring and reporting model? I guess you've seen a few of them, but maybe you could give us a flavour.
So I think there is certainly a big focus around fiduciary management is not a pure assets play. It's all about assets and liabilities together. So a lot of that reporting really starts from thinking about funding level and risks relative to liabilities, right? So there's definitely a big improvement in that space. Attribution then of performance, of risk on a backward and forward-looking basis, that's all kind of becoming a lot more standard. Where there are lots more differences is in terms of the volume that you want about each different asset class and managers. Now, it is there for you. It is provided. So some trustees want that, some don't. But that's kind of up to you. Ultimately, what you want to make sure is that the monitoring framework links very closely with exactly what you're delegating. So there's a previous question on how do I decide my delegation model. Monitoring needs to relate back to that. So you are delegating investment decisions. You want the right monitoring around that. You are delegating operations. So you want to have the right monitoring around that, and likewise again for fee transparency. So that for us is become very much a standard. There are subtle differences across different providers, but it is perhaps the one area where there is just the most flexibility. We've never found a situation where we've asked a fiduciary manager, could you please provide this for us, and then the answer has come back as saying no, we can't. It is available there.
I think one thing I'd add to that, Rikhav, is that yes, the monthly, quarterly reporting, the annual reporting and reviews, they are very important. But, and this is a big difference with the traditional investment consulting model, actually they're only the tip of the iceberg. Underneath, you've got an ongoing, continuous risk management and monitoring process, pre-trade monitoring, post-trade monitoring, monitoring all the risk statistics on an absolute basis, relative basis against the liabilities. And that's something that we are doing in the background. The trustees have got the comfort that that's happening. And if a concern arises, we hit a bandwidth, the risk goes over a trigger level, markets move past a trigger level, we will be immediately talking to the client, or perhaps where we've got triggers for action in place, taking action proactively. And so monitoring is not just a backwards-looking thing. Actually, it's a continuous forward-looking thing in the fiduciary management world.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Rikhav. So just to recap, we've looked today at three main elements. The first was the selection process and the value that can be added by using an independent advisor as part of that process. And I think we agreed that there is certainly value to be added with using an independent advisor, and that the cost can be fairly minor in the context of the wider costs. And in fact, Rikhav made the point that actually costs have been coming down substantially in the fiduciary space, and often, in fact, are lower than in the traditional advisory space. We also talked about the transition and how that can be broken down really into three elements. So there's agreeing the client agreement up front. There's the actual transition. There's the introduction of a new investment strategy, and then the actual transition of the assets. And it's important to note that those three things can happen in parallel, and that can be a much more efficient way of doing it. And lastly, we looked at how business as usual looks going forward once you've got your manager in place, and the ongoing oversight and monitoring of that manager. And we had some insights from Jeff and Rikhav on how that can look and feel going forward. So I'd like to thank Jeff and Rikhav again for their input today. I'd like to thank Mira from the MenCap Pension Plan for her insights as well. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your time today. If you do have any more questions, please feel free you can still ask those questions, and we will get back to you via email later after the webinar. So thank you for your time.